So the Windrush is renamed the Empire Windrush, and it goes out to Mexico or whatever it is for one journey. And coming back, it finds that it's got some berths, lots of them, free, 1,027, I think it was, free spaces on this ship. And they get to Jamaica and they put out a notice saying, free spaces, if you want to come to Britain, £28 would buy you a berth. And people sold their animals, they borrowed money, they looked under the mattress and got some savings, and they put together the £28 to come to Britain. Right. It may well be that that was the first time so many people at one time had come to Britain. But that was not the first time that black people from the Caribbean had come to Britain. That's the point. And those who came met a settled population. All of those people who had come from Africa and the Caribbean to fight the First World War, 1914 to 1918, a matter of a couple of decades after enslavement had finished. They came, many of them, the majority of them, died on the battlefields of Europe. Those who survived and were demobbed remained in this country, mainly in the major port areas, Cardiff, London, South Shields in Tyneside, Liverpool, Manchester. Many of them married white women or white men. And there was a thriving black heritage population in all of those places. You've only got to interrogate the history of Liverpool to understand that. In Cardiff, there is a massive population of mixed heritage people who are of Caribbean, African, and native Welsh extraction. And they were there before this wretched boat docked rather, in 1948. As I say in a chapter in my forthcoming book, which is called Don't Salvage the Windrush. 3 years before that book landed, before that boat came, there was this massive, historic 1945 Pan-African Congress, the 5th Pan-African Congress. And attending that were people from those communities I've just been talking about. And I list them in the book. The book written by Professor Hakim Addy with Marika Sherwood about the 1945 Pan-African Congress details all of that. Close historical detail. All those organizations that were represented at that conference. People living in Manchester, in Bristol, in wherever. And the conference addressed itself to the issue of racism in Britain. So it was concerned about three things. It was concerned about the need for independent sovereign states in the countries which Britain had colonized, across the African continent and indeed in the Caribbean and North America. So there was an anti-colonial campaign movement for national independence. And they were very explicit about that at that conference. They were also very explicit about the need to combat the racism that people were experiencing in Britain. Okay. So whether Sam King knew about the 1945 Pan-African Congress or not, whether he knew about Arthur Lewis's work on labor in the West Indies or not, whether he knew that Eric Williams had come to Britain and studied and wrote Capitalism and Slavery or not, is in one sense immaterial. Because you see, what he could not have been ignorant of is the fact that although the Windrush came and brought 500 of them from across the region in 1948, between 1948 and 1962, when the Commonwealth Immigrants Act was passed, and I'll come back to that in a minute, there were over 125,000 people who had come from the Caribbean. The majority of them, between 1959 and 1962, when it became clear that the British were about to impose these restrictions on entry. So that boat made one journey. It brought those first group of, some say 492, some say 500, whatever it is. But all of those people came afterwards on different ships. My uncle came in 1951, my father 1957. We got used to names such as the Ascania, the Sorrento, the Auriga, the Castle. We got used to those kinds of names. Nobody talked about the Windrush. Right? So the point I'm making is that it is a myth. And it is a myth constructed by Sam King, who himself says when he decided to come back to Britain, and he didn't like what he found in Jamaica when he got back. In fact, none of them as ex-service people did, because they were in penury, they were destitute. They had to throw themselves at the mercy of the community. Having been 5 years in Britain fighting a war. He decided he didn't like British colony life in Jamaica. And he didn't want his children to grow up in those conditions. So he would come to the motherland. The man says, I didn't want to live in a colony. So he's coming to the motherland. And he determined, even before he left Jamaica, that this one trip that this boat was making was going to be the equivalent of the Mayflower. Right? He said it openly. He wanted the Windrush to be the Mayflower. So the Mayflower left with some Puritans and Christians who wanted to break away from the Church of England and all of that lot, and went to the United States. They had all kinds of hurricanes and everything else. Eventually ended up displacing local indigenous people to establish themselves. And like before, many of the people who were around, whom they had subdued and subjugated, died from diseases that they had brought. And their purpose was to colonize. They were going to colonize that part of the New World. This man, King, had this crazy notion that he was coming with a few people from the Caribbean, presumably to reform and remake Britain after the Second World War. So when I talk about myth making, that is exactly what I mean. You see, we can't understand the Windrush scandal and what Theresa May as Prime Minister of this country did with the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts unless you understand 1948. So people are remembering 1948 as the year this boat came with its God knows how many Caribbean people. And they remember in 1948 as the year the National Health Service started. And they're making these grandiloquent claims about we, British black Caribbean nurses, build the National Health Service. And to a large extent, that's true. But you can't forget that third leg of 1948, the 1948 Nationality Act. Let me use an analogy. I suppose millions of people around the world was mortified, I think the word would be, when I learned about this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, that this very dodgy cleric, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, had presided over in apartheid South Africa. I do not believe that he or anybody in that generation had the right to absolve the apartheid regime then and before on behalf of those who had gone and suffered and died as a result of apartheid. They did not have that right. So the Truth and Reconciliation project was about reconciliation, forgiveness, peace, laying the foundations for non-repetition of conflict, blah, blah, blah. All a myth. It handed power to those who had used that power barbarically against Africans. It handed even more power to them. It handed power to those Africans who were waiting to jump into the shoes of the apartheid leaders. But we had an experience of neocolonialism across Africa and the African diaspora. That didn't come as any surprise. You know, whether it was Thabo Mbeki or that unbelievable man Jacob Zuma, it didn't matter who it was. There was always that possibility. So if you didn't dismantle the state and build again based on the experiences of the people and work through those contradictions with reparations for all of that suffering, making sure that you factored in non-repetition. I mean, how is it, for Christ's sake, that 30 years after Mandela is released, you have the Marikana massacre, London mining, with people who are African themselves leading police and army to go and gun down other Africans to protect London's interests. How is that possible? Okay, so what is the relevance between all of that and what we're talking about? My problem with the whole Windrush narrative and Windrush project, and with the likes of Patrick Vernon, Arthur Torrington, and that Windrush Brigade, is that they're behaving like Tutu and that lot in South Africa. They are effectively trying to exonerate the British state and not hold it responsible for the condition of those people who came and what they met and what it continued to do to them. Because you see, the 1948 Nationality Act said, you are citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies, right? You have citizenship status. But even when they were passing that act, there were those saying, never mind all of this business. We don't want those people here. They do not belong. And you can't possibly send out a signal to them that they would be welcome. Even when that boat was crossing the Atlantic, there were moves to turn it back and send it back to where it was coming from. Right? So my point is this. Whatever views the British may have had about calming down these blacks and diverting their attention into celebrating nonsense, we encouraged it. That's my point. We encourage it, and we're encouraging it big time. I mean, I am utterly amazed at the number of Windrush projects that there are around the place. You know, endless books being written about it. And I think to myself, well, all right, how is that possible? My father came here in 1957. I was still in Grenada, a 12-year-old boy. 1958, we learnt of riots in Notting Hill, just down the way from where he lived. Riots in Nottingham. We were concerned because there were race riots. White people wanting to kill black people. Black people having to find all kinds of stratagems to defend themselves and make it clear that they won't sit down and be killed. As a boy, I was learning about all of that. And then 1 year later, news reaches us that Kelso Cochrane, one of those migrants from the Caribbean, is actually murdered on the streets of Notting Hill by some whites. Panic in the place. Everybody, what's going to happen? We were concerned. What's going to happen to our father? What's going to happen to our uncle who had been here since 1951? Everybody was concerned about their relatives who had come. There wasn't organized protests by the Windrush passengers. There was no collective reaction to that. The police decided that because of the riots that had taken place in 1958, they wouldn't pursue those who were known to have been involved in Kelso Cochrane's murder. So to this day, nobody has been held to account. So in 1959, so in 1981, when those 13 young people were killed in New Cross, so in 1993, when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. So the state and its police had form, in other words, right? Okay, so my point is this. Every piece of legislation since the 1962 Immigration Act has been more draconian, meant to hurt black people, to deter them from coming, but also sending out a message to the institutions of state, the courts, particularly the police, who's supposed to be keeping us safe, and to the right wing within the elements within the nation. National Front, British National Party, Column 88. They changed their names, they changed their style as the decades wear on. And they were and remain very active. They have always been an active force in the society. Before Enoch Powell, after Enoch Powell, And not only towards us as African people. That's the other flaw in that whole Windrush debate. Those acts I'm talking about, 1962, 1965, 1968, 1971 particularly, were not all, they weren't exclusively targeted at Caribbean people. People from the African continent, people from South Asia particularly, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, were all subject to that nonsense. The police were talking about going nigger hunting in areas where we lived as black people. They talked, and the right-wing factions with them talked about Paki bashing. And they went around murdering Asian people in their homes, on the streets, as they did their jobs. Can't remember what year it was, in Seven Kings, in East London. One older man, Asian man, collecting tickets, asked some white racists to show their tickets, and one of them pulls out a crossbow and shoots him through the neck and kills him. David Olawale, tortured and killed by police in West Yorkshire, Leeds, 1969. So, and then of course, we've had the police themselves, year on year on year, decade after decade, killing loads of black people and calling it deaths in custody, as if black people had some unnatural propensity to die of natural causes when they're in the company of the police, in the custody of the police. Complete nonsense. Police killings, murder, manslaughter. That's what it is. Okay? So my question is, okay, I know it's a litany of horrors, right? In addition to all of that, ever since I was studying in Oxford in the middle 1960s, we had to be struggling against the practice of sending all of these children who were coming to join parents, sending them to schools for the educationally subnormal. So a whole litany of horrors that the state imposed upon us. And then, but we didn't sit down and take it on the chin. We resisted. That's the point. We resisted. And the same culture of struggle against oppression that we had honed in the Caribbean in order to survive. You know, what we leave, we carry. We carried that here. And it enabled us to resist those kinds of oppression, systemic oppression that I'm talking about. And we have to remember that. So then my problem is this, right? Against that background, against the background of Theresa May as Home Secretary, sending out these vans around London in 2013, huge billboards slapped against the sides of the vans. Go home or face arrest. And she said that was targeted at illegal immigrants. UKIP was trying to get the Conservative government to demonstrate that it could be harder on immigrants because that was the elephant in the room as far as the British state was concerned. And every single party in every single decade, including Labour, from the very beginning, was using immigration as the kind of touchstone in their electoral hustings and so on and so forth. Immigration was the big deal. So those same people who are now celebrating, we came and we built Britain and so on, the Labour Party couldn't give a toss about them and what they were contributing to our building. Nor could the Conservatives. In 1965, Roy Hattersley Labor Home Secretary, government of Harold Wilson, gets up and pronounces while they're trying to pass this 1965 legislation, he announces with typical English doublespeak, trying to sound clever, without integration, limiting immigration would be inexcusable. But without limiting immigration, integration would be impossible. Okay, so and if you want to understand how the racialization of immigration was set in stone, you've just got to look at what happened between 1948, 1962, that act that prohibited people coming as those did on that Windrush in 1948. You just got to look at that period up to 1965. In other words, we are not being racist. We are just so concerned about those whom we've already let in. They need to be integrated, and the responsibility for being integrated was theirs. And I mean, it's cynical as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so what befuddles me is, against that particular history, how have we arrived at where we are now with this Windrush nonsense? How have we been able to simply erase from our memory all of that stuff I'm talking about in terms of our interface with Britain and the systemic racism within Britain? How have we been able to brush that aside and romanticize our presence and all we have contributed to the society? What about the disproportionate number of us who've ended up in prisons? What about the fact that 75% of people in remand centers are black and global majority, Caribbean, African, Asian, in a place where our percentage in the population is hardly 12%. So and how about the fact that from the 60s till now, we as Caribbean people, black Caribbean boys particularly, have been bumping along the bottom of the schooling outcome statistics. So where has all of that gone? Where does it feature in this nonsensical, reductive, backward, colonial Windrush narrative?